Okay, so now I want to talk about the process by which we nominate presidential candidates. Now, here's something important to keep in mind. I'm going to be talking about presidential candidates for a little while here, but what is that? Hold on, I have a little red dot there. Okay, sorry. I accidentally put a red dot. As it turns out, I guess I can do that. Here we go. There we go. I didn't know I could do that. Okay. There we go. Sorry. Just playing with the video here. Okay. Wife's laughing in the background. Okay. I want to talk about the process of nominating presidential candidates. But in this case, I want to be clear that everything that I'm saying applies to all other elections. It's going to apply to when we elect governors, when we elect state senators, state representatives, our members of the House of Representatives, and also going to apply when we elect senators. This is all true. Because what happened was we changed the way that we nominated presidents. And when we changed the way that we nominated presidents, we changed the way that we nominated everybody else. And so I'm going to talk about that to talk about the bigger question of why is it that our leaders are more extreme than we are. So with that in mind, in the early years of the Republic, the way the parties selected their nominees, remember the nominee is going to be the person who moves from the primary election to the general election. Well, way back in the day, they didn't have primary elections at all. What happened was very powerful members in Congress got together and they just selected who the nominee was going to be. They would get together and talk amongst themselves and say, you know what, let's have this guy be our representative, the nominee in our next election. And then they would vote and then agree on it, and that person would be the person on the ballot for the party. And usually what they tended to do was select people who had some experience with national politics, somebody that they knew, usually somebody that they interacted with. So that's why a lot of our first presidents were also secretaries of state, secretaries of war, things like that, where they held positions in the government. By the 1900s, people started to be bothered by the fact that citizens weren't involved in the selection process, that people didn't have a vote. They were just sort of presented with somebody who was the nominee. And so each of the parties wanted to sort of have more of an input. The people in the parties, we sometimes refer to them as the rank and file. Rank, R-A-N-K and file, rank and file, which just means your average party member. They wanted to have some sort of say in who the nominee was going to be in the general election. And so what they started to do is they started to have what are called national conventions, nominating conventions. And the way it would work is this, is that let's say we're coming up to a presidential election. Again, I'm talking about presidential elections, but this is going to apply to everybody else as well, all the other elected offices. All the national, state, and local officials from one particular party, so let's talk about the Democratic Party, all the national officials, the state officials, the local officials, and then people who just worked for the party but didn't have an office, they'd all go meet at a convention somewhere, and they would get together, and they would, in theory at least, hash out amongst themselves who they wanted their nominee to be in the upcoming presidential election, who they wanted to be the standard bearer for their party. So the Democrats would all get together in a convention in some city, and they would go ahead and try and decide who they wanted it to be, who they wanted their nominee to be, and the Republicans would do the same thing. So you see literally thousands of people getting together, and then all of them, each state casting votes for who they want to be the nominee. It all appeared very democratic. A lot of people involved, a whole bunch of people, not just members of Congress, but a whole big hall of thousands of people. But as it turns out, in reality, what was going on is that there were big, important party leaders who were behind in closed doors going ahead with one another cutting deals about who they wanted. And the party leaders would be negotiating with one another behind closed doors. All these people down at the convention wearing their little hats, blowing their little horns, pretending like they're involved in this incredible democratic process, when really what's going on is in smoke-filled rooms somewhere else, you've got the party leaders going ahead and making a bunch of deals with one another. Well, you give me that, I'll give you this. You make this person Secretary of State, this, and that was the trade-off. And then once they'd all decided what they wanted to do, the party leaders would go down and tell people on the floor at the convention, all the other people, here's who you're voting for. And people would vote for who their party boss, that's what they would call them, their party boss said to vote for. Now, sometimes if they couldn't come up with an agreement, what would happen is everybody would get together. The bigwigs, the party bosses, couldn't come to an agreement. They would hold a vote to see who the nominee was going to be, and nobody would get a majority. Then they'd have to go back and start negotiating again until finally they could come up with an agreement on who they wanted their nominee to be. In some cases, there were many votes. I think in one case there were more than 100 votes at the convention, which is not usually a good sign. If your party's having that much trouble selecting somebody, probably the final person that they select isn't going to be somebody who's got a tremendous amount of support. Probably most people are going to be pissed off. So in any case, that's the way that it used to be selected, that nominees used to be selected. And then the Democratic Convention in 1968 happened, and it was a debacle. Now, I'm not going to test you on any of this history, but I think it's important for you to know. So if you were taking notes, don't worry about it. You don't have to take any notes. I'll tell you when you need to start again. In the 1968 presidential election, the Republican nominee was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was clearly the nominee. It wasn't a particularly brutal primary, and so that was settled fairly easily. But in the Democratic primary, it was a little bit different. The president at the time, Lyndon Johnson, hadn't made it clear whether or not he was going to run for office again. And then partway as the campaign started, all of a sudden Lyndon Johnson announced he's not running again. He's not going to run for another term. It was a very difficult time. We were in the middle of the war in Vietnam. We had all the civil rights legislation that had been passed. There was a lot of turmoil in the country, and Lyndon Johnson just basically said, I'm out. The vice president at the time was a guy named Hubert Humphrey. He didn't make any announcement as to whether or not he was going to run or not. He didn't say anything. But the primaries were still going on. People were still running for office. And one of the guys who said that he was going to run for office and he was going to run for the presidency was a guy named Eugene McCarthy. Now, Eugene McCarthy was kind of like the Barack Obama of 1968. He was anti-war, and young people loved this guy. He was running again, and his idea was he was going to get us out of Vietnam. And young people thought this guy was the greatest. And so they got out and they voted for him in the primary elections in large numbers. He ran in primary elections and won them over and over and over again. Hubert Humphrey, in the meantime, didn't run in any primaries. There were a couple people who supported him that ran in primaries, but he never ran in a primary. And what wound up happening is because back then, when people ran in primaries, the party leaders are the ones who make the decision about who the nominee was going to be. The reason Eugene McCarthy was running in all these primaries was to go ahead and prove to the party leaders, hey, I got some support here, man. I got a lot of people who are willing to come out and vote for me. You should make me the nominee. This is what John Kennedy did. When John Kennedy in 1960 was trying to get the nomination, he didn't run in a whole bunch of primaries. One primary he did run in, for sure, was in West Virginia. Why? Because John Kennedy was a Catholic, and because people were really concerned about whether or not a Catholic could win the presidency. West Virginia is a Protestant state. So he went in and he entered into the primary in West Virginia, and he won, as a way of going ahead and proving to the party leadership, hey, look, I just went into a Protestant state and won. And the party leadership was like, okay, cool. And he became the nominee. Well, like I say, McCarthy ran in many and won many primaries. Hubert Humphrey sat him out. When the convention came, the party leaders selected Hubert Humphrey as the nominee. And the city of Chicago, which is where their convention was being held, and all those people who were supporters of Eugene McCarthy and some who had supported Robert Kennedy before he was assassinated freaked out. It turned into a bloody battle where they were fighting with the cops, busted heads. It was just awful. And when the campaign came around, one of the things that Richard Nixon did was he just showed commercials of what the Democratic convention looked like, and it looked like he was showing pictures from Vietnam. There were so many pleas and heads being cracked and people on the ground and burning flags and all kinds of stuff. Well, the Democratic Party was so upset, and there were so many people who were active in the Democratic Party that were so upset that they went ahead and they decided to change the rules and make the rules new for how we were going to select our presidential candidates. But again, it affected how we select all our candidates. What they adopted as a result of this thing that happened in 1968 is something called the McGovern-Fraser reforms. The McGovern-Fraser reforms. So that's what we're going to be talking about in the next video. The McGovern-Fraser reforms. Once we start again, we need to start taking notes.